All right, hello. Welcome to our study of the book of Nehemiah. This is for the Bible study group that we're assembling here, and I'm going to probably drop it on YouTube as well, in case anybody is out there wants to read along and be part of the discussion. And let me pull up today's verses. I'm going to be as I said in the book of Nehemiah, we're going to start in chapter 1. So Nehemiah, a prophet, right? We know that Nehemiah is an Old Testament book of Scripture. It is actually the last book written chronologically before the New Testament, right? So Nehemiah covers a period of, I think, 14 years. Majority of it's in 1 year. And then there's a brief period that speaks to the other 13 years. After the book of Nehemiah, it's 445-ish BC. After the book of Nehemiah, we have a few hundred years of silence, really. And then the New Testament starts. Of course, the New Testament, the book of Matthew starts it off. Really, technically speaking, the beginning of Matthew is Old Testament because you can't have the Testament switch until you have the death of the testator. So until we see the death of Christ, that's really the point where we switch to the New Testament. So that's interesting to look at, but this topic for another discussion. But Nehemiah is not the last book in order in the Bible, but it's the last book that was written chronologically. We'll see like Malachi, for instance, is written after Nehemiah, or appears in the Bible after Nehemiah, but Malachi was Nehemiah's contemporary, and so they were both alive and at the same time, and Malachi is prophesying at the same time as Nehemiah was generally, and so we see that there. As I say, really Nehemiah chronologically is the last in the timeline, the last writing of the Old Testament. And so Nehemiah, we believe, was written by Ezra. Ezra was the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah in the old Jewish canon, original Jewish canon, appeared as one writing. And of course, in our Bibles today, they're separated, but we believe Ezra wrote the book of Nehemiah. He wrote it from the perspective of Nehemiah, and so he's writing it in the second person. And so it's as if Nehemiah himself is speaking, but we believe it was written by Ezra. And so we're going to start in verse 1:1. There's an interesting concept in chapter 1, but really the beginning of chapter 2. Not sure if we'll get that far today, but I just want to start off. We're going to read through some verses in chapter 1, starting, of course, in verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hekaliah. And it came to pass in the month Chislev, I think that's pronounced Chislev, I'm sorry, in the 20th year, as I was in the Shushan, the palace, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem, and they said unto me, the remnant that are left out of captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And it came to pass when I heard these words, that I sat down and I wept, and I mourned certain days, and fasted, and prayed before the God of heaven. So interesting. Hananiah is Nehemiah's brother. He comes back. Nehemiah, of course, we know is in the temple of King Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is the son of Xerxes. Xerxes was the king that took Esther as his queen, and so we're, in the future, his son is now reigning in the palace, Persian palace, and Hananiah comes he's believed to have been with Ezra in Jerusalem. He comes back, he returns, and can imagine Nehemiah, he's never been to Jerusalem, right? We know that after the Babylonian conquer of Jerusalem, they left the city in ruins. They left the wall in ruins. That was some 90 years prior to this point. And it's still, to this point, still in ruins. And, I can imagine Nehemiah as a young child, as a young man growing up, hearing stories from his ancestors and about the grandeur of the palace and the grandeur of the city of Jerusalem, and as they remembered in its former glory. And so now to hear that after all this time, because Ezra went back as a teacher and he led like the second wave of the restoration, and we're going to see Nehemiah is going to go back in the third wave. But I think it was probably reasonable to expect that there would have been some progress on the reconstruction of Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah, I believe, he's disheartened to learn that there hasn't been any, and that the walls are still down. It's in great distress. And so we see he stops and he prays, right? And he prays and fasts, it says, some days. And so this is an important component of the book of Nehemiah. We're going to see that Nehemiah he's more than just a faithful man of prayer. He certainly is that, but he's immersed in a culture of prayer. Nehemiah he's all about the prayer, right? So he's trying to rely on God to show him, he's getting this burden, and we're going to see in the verses going forward, he's going to have this burden to return to Jerusalem and to build the walls. And so he relies on God to work all those details out. Nehemiah is a man of faith. We see it reminds me a lot of David. When King David faced Goliath, he said, like they looked at him like, paraphrasing, "You're a boy, what are you going to do against this giant?" He says, "It's not me. It's, I'm not doing this. It's this, I represent the army of the living God. This is God that's going to do this." And so we see that faith that these people, they realize, these Old Testament saints realize that they can do nothing in their own power, that it's God that directs them, God that guides them. And so we're going to see that in Nehemiah here in the coming verses. Now, the month Chislev in the Hebrew calendar is late fall, like November, December, right? And so that's going to become important in a few verses down. But just to set that up, this happens. He comes and he gets this word. It's late fall. So let's continue. We'll continue in verse 5. And said, "I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God, that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him and observe his commandments. Let thine ear now be attentive, and thine eyes open, that thou mayest hear and pray of thy servant, which I pray thee before thee now day and night, for the children of Israel, thy servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against thee. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We have dealt very corruptly against thee, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgments, which thou commandest thy servant Moses. Remember, I beseech thee, the word that thou commandest thy servant Moses, saying, If ye transgress, I will scatter you abroad among the nations. But if ye turn unto me, and keep my commandments, and do them, though there were of you cast out unto the uttermost part of the heaven, yet I will gather them from thence, and bring them unto the place that I have chosen to set my name there. Now these are thy servants and thy people, whom thou hast redeemed by the great power and by thy strong hand. O Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant, and to the prayer of thy servants, who desire to fear thy name, and prosper, I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy, in the sight of this man. For I was the king's cupbearer. So Nehemiah is repenting for the sins of Israel. We know Israel, the nation of Israel, went against God, right? They started, false gods and just getting away from the commandments and the precepts of God. And so the judgment came, and that judgment was in the form of the Babylonian siege, if you will. They came in, they wiped out Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem. They scattered the Jewish nation, they scattered the Jews abroad and into exile. And again, now it's 90 years later. Some of them have returned, some of them remained, some of them returned. Ezra brought another group in, and we're going to see, as I said earlier, Nehemiah is going to bring, I believe it was 42,000 and lead them back, and that's the final restoration. He's praying again. We're seeing that, that culture of prayer. He's repenting. He's saying, we know that you've promised to restore us if we repent, and so I'm repenting on behalf of the nation. And he says in the final statement in verse 11, for I was the king's cupbearer. Now the king's cupbearer is, we think, kind of like a butler, right? Like he's, bring me my wine type of deal, right? And he goes and he gets it, or he makes sure the meat's cooked just to the certain way the king likes it. And certainly that is a responsibility of the cupbearer, but the cupbearer bears a larger responsibility. The cupbearer is responsible for the entire food chain, from beginning to end, right to where it meets the king, right? So imagine in those times, if somebody wished ill harm against the king, his enemies, they couldn't get into the stronghold of the palace, but if they could poison the food somehow, they could get the king that way, right? So Nehemiah was expected, and cupbearer, whoever it was expected to taste all the food. Every single thing he set before the king, he was to taste it himself. And so that job of cupbearer was all-encompassing in that whole entire food chain, not just preparing the food, but sourcing the food, preparing it, making sure it's fresh, making sure it's the way the king likes it, and making sure it's safe from contaminants. And so part of that was, as I said, he would taste it. So if it was poison, then he would die first, and the king would know not to eat it, right? It seems crazy, but that's how it was. So this position of cupbearer was kind of a high-ranking position in the court of the king, in the palace. And so Nehemiah, certainly, this would lead us to believe Nehemiah was a trusted servant of the king. There was a level of trust there, and there was a level of relationship that the king didn't have with everybody. And it was widely known that this was his responsibility. So certainly there was trust, right? So that's going to be important going forward, because we're going to see, and this is kind of the crux of the message for today's study. I'm going to flip ahead to chapter 2, and in chapter 2, it starts off, now we've established, their relationship. Now, again, that, this isn't a job that Nehemiah just punches in and out. Like, he doesn't come in, it's not a 9-to-5 gig, right? He's there. He probably lives there. And he's, the king gets hungry at 3 a.m. Nehemiah is expected to get up, I'm sure, and prepare this meal and check it and taste it and do all this stuff. So this is a hands-on position. This isn't a job that you get sick days or vacation days, or that you could just take off anytime you want, right? This is a big commitment on the part of Nehemiah. And so verse 1 in chapter 2 says, and it came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him. And I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had not been before time sad in his presence. So Nehemiah is saying, now we're in the month Nisan. Now the month Nisan is late, early spring. It's March or April, right? So we see that Nehemiah, in the prior chapter, in the month Chislev, which was the fall, he gets this burden to go back and rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. He prays to God. And it says through his prayer that he knew God was going to restore his people, and he promised through repentance he would restore them. And so he believes that it's not a question of, does God want me to go? It's a question of, when will God open that door for me to go, right? And so 4 months every day he comes in, does his job, and he doesn't show any kind of burden or sadness. And it says right here, it says here, now I had not been before time sad in his presence. We have to understand, in the culture here, being sad for the inner court of the king, for them to show displeasure or sadness or discontent in any way in the presence of the king was a crime, basically punishable by death. So Nehemiah is making it a point of saying, I did not show this burden to the king. I did not show him that my heart was for the people of Jerusalem, that I wanted to go back and build this wall, or that I believed that God wanted me to go back and build this wall. I was not sad before time in his presence. Verse 2 says, wherefore the king said unto me, why is thy countenance sad? Seeing thou art not sick, this is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was sore afraid. Right? So he makes a point of saying, to try to track with this, like he makes a point of saying, I didn't show the king any sadness, yet in the next verse he says he saw that I was sad. And he says, what's the reason for this? It's nothing more but sorrow of heart. It's like, you're not happy here? And so he knows now that he's just tipped his hand. Not that he tipped it, but the king somehow knew. And so this is a crime punishable by death. And so he says, then I was sore afraid. Of course he was afraid. This could be the end of his life, right? And so the king, what happens here is God shows the king this. This is a divine, if Nehemiah had not shown he was sad, how could the king know that he was sad? God put it on his heart. This is God opening the door to Nehemiah. And Nehemiah knows that. And so Nehemiah gets afraid, because Nehemiah knows that, number one, the king could kill me over this. And this is kind of where, faith and fear collide, right? Because Nehemiah is a man of faith. He believes God wants him to go rebuild these walls of Jerusalem. And he wants to follow God. He's got the faith to do that. But here we see that he certainly is afraid. It's interesting, because we'll hear people say fear is the absence of faith, or fear shows a lack of faith, or words to that effect. But really, that's not accurate. I mean, fear and faith live together inside the heart. They dwell together, right? We've seen that all through the Bible. Look at Joshua in the beginning, in the first chapter of Joshua. The Lord appears to Joshua and he says, be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid. I will be with you. And he says to him several times, don't be afraid, right? And so why does an all-knowing God tell Joshua not to be afraid? Because he knows that he is, right? I mean, there's no other, it's logical, common sense. He's appearing to him, and he knows that he's afraid, so he's trying to come, he's trying to comfort him, he's trying to encourage him, he's trying to strengthen him. He says, hey, don't be afraid. I got you. I got this. Because Moses is dead. Joshua's chosen to go forth and conquer the promised land, and God said, this is the land I'm going to give my people. But Joshua has to go take it now. So he's going to, really, for the first time in Israelite history, they're going to face their enemies in war. And so, of course, there's fear in that, right? Joshua's got to draw his sword, and he's got to fight these people, and he's got to take this land. So it's natural to be afraid. And so we see here in Nehemiah, and clearly Nehemiah admits, I was sore afraid, right? But fear and faith at this moment for Nehemiah collide. He feels this burden from God to go rebuild the wall, but yet he's now been confronted with the king. But in a way, that's the answer to his prayer, because he's been praying to God to open this door for him to present this burden to the king, and here he has. And so God's done that. He's opened the door. He's put it on the king's heart to know that Nehemiah was afraid. And so, that Nehemiah was burdened for the people of Israel. So Nehemiah says, I'm afraid. Now, if Nehemiah's fear controlled him at this moment, he probably would have made an excuse, right? He probably would have said something like, oh, no, I'm not sad, you're misunderstanding, or something I ate, I just got indigestion, I have a little pain in my stomach, whatever, I'm sorry if I winced, whatever. He would have scrambled to try to find some kind of excuse, but he doesn't do that, right? We're going to see in the next verse. In the next verse, he says in verse 3, and I said unto the king, let the king live forever. Right? He starts off with like a little Eddie Haskell moment, right? Like, let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad? When the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth in waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire. Then the king said unto me, for what dost thou make request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Right, so there he is again. He's in this culture of prayer. He's in this conversation with the king and stops mid-sentence and starts to pray to God, right? And we're seeing that Nehemiah certainly is this, he's living in this culture of fear. Culture of prayer. And so the king, when Nehemiah says he wants to go, the king says to him, well, then the king said to me, for what dost thou make request? And I said unto the king, if it please the king, and if thy servant have found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. And the king said unto me, the queen also sitting by him, for how long shall thy journey be? And when wilt thou return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set a time. Now we're going to find out later on that he ends up being there 12 years. But now, in this moment, Nehemiah has chosen, he's made the conscious choice to let his faith be greater than his fear. He's let his faith to guide him, not his fear. He had fear, he had faith. He pushed his fear down and he moved forward, and he told the king, I got this burden. Why wouldn't I be sad? Look, the city of my ancestors, the city of my fathers, it's in ruins. How can I not be sad, right? Basically. And so the king's saying, well, what are you asking? And he's saying, I pray you would send me to the city, right? You would send me to rebuild. So he's going to go, and we're going to see God's going to continue to work, because he's going to bless Nehemiah in this. So, moreover, I said unto the king, if it please the king, let letters be given to me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over till I come to Judah. So basically he's saying, if he's going one more step, and he's saying, well, if it's not too much trouble, can you give me letters to take with me, because they'll convey me over, right? In other words, like, they'll allow me safe passage. If I come to any of the, armies along the way or whatever, through these provinces and through these cities that I go through, if he's got a letter from the king, right, who's going to mess with him? They don't know who he is, but they pull him over and they stop him, and he says, oh, what are you coming through here for? Well, look, I got a letter from the king. He wants me to go to Judah. And so, okay, so they're going to move out of the way, and they're going to let him go through, so they're going to convey him over. So this letter is indicative of, it's like a safe passage, right? It's ensuring safe passage for Nehemiah to Judah. And so then he says, and a letter unto Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace, which appertain to the house and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall enter into. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. So he's asking for another letter. It's basically saying, modern day terms, right? He's saying to the king, hey, can I have the Home Depot card? Because I'm going to have this project that I want to build, and I got to get the materials from somewhere. So, I know you've control all the resources in the area. Maybe you can give me a letter to send to this guy Asaph, who controls the timber industry, and then I'll pull up and he'll tell him what I'll need and he'll give it to me. And so the king does. The king grants him that, right? And so, and he says, according to the good hand of my God upon me. So he's giving God the glory and the praise and the honor for this. He's saying, and we'll see this as a theme throughout Nehemiah. He's saying, this is God that's doing this. This is God's mission. It's God's purpose. God's working it out. He's shown the king my burden. He's softened the king's heart to let me go. He's going to now allow the king to give me letters, and we're going to see God's going to go even further and do things that Nehemiah doesn't even ask for, right? But it's important to see that God is at work here, and this is the purpose. This is God's purpose, and that's, Nehemiah often, even in the secular world, he's lifted up as used as an example of a good leader, and certainly in ministry, Nehemiah is shown as an example of a good leader. He's got discernment. He's does all the things right in his leadership style, and so books have been written about it, and we're seeing that, and that certainly is born out of this culture of prayer, this demeanor that he's saying, the hand of my God, my good God upon me, right? So he's saying, Nehemiah is giving God thanks and praise for everything, and that leads to him being a good leader. And in a good leader, whether it be a husband in the home or a pastor or people in the church setting, or missionaries or any evangelists, any kind of mission or ministry leader is going to have that demeanor. They're going to have that biblical worldview. They're going to put God first. They're going to recognize God's sovereign authority and power in their life and in their work and all that they do. And that's a very important part of leadership. And so that's adverse or contrary to what the world does often. But, what else is new about that? The world's always contrary to the things of God. That's why we're in the shape we're in. But that's a story for another time too. But it's a story for all time, and it's worked into this because we're seeing that contrast here, and we're seeing that example Nehemiah is giving. And so that's important. And then he says, and then I came, verse 9, then I came to the governors beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. So he didn't ask for that. He didn't ask for a military escort, but God intended to give it to him. He thought he needed it, so he said, God said, he didn't say, but he put it on the king's heart to supply this military escort. Nehemiah never asked. Now, this is how God works sometimes, because it doesn't really tell us, but God will use selfish worldly things sometimes of people's own selfish desires to accomplish his goals and to set his purposes, support his purposes. Did the king send the military escort because he was worshiping God and because he thought that God would have liked him to do it? Maybe. It doesn't say that, but there's no real indication that was the case. The Artaxerxes could have had his own motivations for that. Certainly, Jerusalem was a ways off from Persia, right? So Artaxerxes probably thought to himself, or could have certainly thought to himself, boy, it's really in my best interest to have Jerusalem rebuilt and strengthened and as a stronghold. If I send, that might be part of the reason why he allowed Nehemiah. If I send Nehemiah to do this, that's really in my best interest militarily and politically. And so maybe that's why he sent the military escort with him. Maybe he said, let them see that. So he supplies this military escort. He probably has ulterior motives. It's going to help Nehemiah's cause. Nehemiah shows up, and he's got this mission to rebuild the walls. And so verse 10 says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. So I came to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. Right, so so Sanballat the Horonite. Now, we don't know Sanballat. Some people say, that was a guy's name. Some say it was Sanballat as a rank, a military rank, or an official, like a title of an official. We're not really sure. But Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite. And like the Ammonites are, Palestinians today come from the Ammonites. And so we're seeing these people who, it's interesting, they're the enemies of Israel. They were back in that day, and their descendants are today, right? And so that's interesting that doesn't change through time. But these people are grieved. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. So Nehemiah's coming to help these guys' enemy, right? And so it grieved them exceedingly. Of course it would, because they're thinking like, okay, the same thing on the other side of the coin. Is the king gonna get a stronghold in this area? It's not gonna be good for us. We liked having, Jerusalem is weak. It's torn down. They're living there. Some of the Jews are in exile. Some are still living there, but they're really not any kind of military force or any kind of strength or anything that we have to reckon with. So we kind of like it that way. So it grieved them exceedingly, and we're going to see that to this day there's still nations of people that would like to see the ruination of the nation of Israel, and that's a common thread through time, and it doesn't change. And so God has protected them, and I believe he will protect them. And so it says in verse 11, so I came to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. And I arose in the night, I and some few men with me, neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. Neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. And I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, and to the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire. Then I went on to the gate of the fountain, and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass. Then went I up in the night by the brook, and I viewed the wall, and I turned back, and I entered by the gate of the valley, and so returned. And the rulers knew not whither I went or what I did. Neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work. So this is a quality that leads to Nehemiah's leadership style, right? He shows discernment. He comes in, he's there 3 days. He doesn't do anything for 3 days. He's just assessing the situation. Then he goes out at night and he tours the ruins. And so he takes just a few trusted people with him, but he still at this point hasn't told anybody what he's doing there, right? He's not tipping his hand, right? And it says these groups, he he went to these, there was priests and the leaders, right? He doesn't tell them. He doesn't tell the Jewish people what he's there for. But I think what he's doing is he doesn't want their perspective, right? He's not going on tour with them, and each group would have their own perspective of how they think we should proceed. And there's like a political, like not a governmental political, but like a social political struggle, right? Like everybody wants their own interests to be, supported, and so that's kind of common. And so I think we're seeing that. And so Nehemiah is saying, no, I'm not having that, because Nehemiah, he wants God to lead this mission. This is God's mission. God sent him there. It's going to be through God's power. It's going to be for God's glory. And so he's not bringing in any other factions. And that's a wise discernment for a leader. He's coming in, he's surveying the situation. He's not running in. We've seen, most of us have worked in places where we've seen new managers come in or whatever, and some take that approach and some don't, right? And so we can see the results of each side of that. And it's wise. It shows discernment, it shows wisdom, and it shows a certain style. And in Nehemiah's case, it's because he's honoring God with his choices, and he's saying, this isn't about me, this isn't about my work, I'm not making it about me, I'm not making it about the priests, I'm not making it about the leaders. It's all about God, it's all what God wants, and that's how it's going to go. And so, and I think that's good. And so now we're in, let's see, verse 12. No, I went by night to the gate, consumed with fire. When I went to the gates of the fountain, to the king's pool, I got to just figure where I left off. I went up by night. Okay, and 16, and the rulers knew not whither I went. And verse 17, then said I to them, ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth in waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Then I took them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. So he presents it to the people like, not like, hey, I'm here, I'm going to direct this work, and this is how it's going to be, I'm the leader now. He's more or less saying, the flavor is more or less like, okay, look, this is what God has put on my heart to do, and he wants you to do it, and I'm here to help you do it. And so we're going to do it together. And that's an important distinction. And it's the good work of God. He says, then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me. So he told them the whole story that we just went through from the beginning, how he worked in the king's heart and how he allowed the door to open. He allowed all these things to happen so that the people would see it. Nehemiah didn't wake up one day and say, oh, okay, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to build this wall. No, God moved him there. God directed him there. And these are generally people of faith, and so, he's working with them to do this, and so they're happy to do it. And so he's not like more or less directing them or bossing them. He's just saying, we're going to do this together. And so they do. They it says they strengthen their hands for this good work. Verse 19 and 20. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Gershom the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us, and said, what is this thing that ye do? Will you rebel against the king? Then answered I to them and said unto them, the God of heaven will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build. But ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. So, he's saying, basically, stay in your lane. This has nothing to do with you guys. You don't have anything to do with the work here. You don't stand up for God. You don't have anything to do with the Israelites, the nation of Israel. You've been here through this time. You could have helped, but you didn't. Now stay out of our way. But there it says they laughed them to scorn, right? And we see that a lot of times the enemies of God will do that to discourage the work of God. They'll use ridicule, they'll use scorn, they'll put doubt in the minds and hearts of the people that want to serve the Lord. And I think we're seeing that here with them. As I said, they ridicule them to scorn, right? But they're not having it. Nehemiah stands up and he says, stay in your lane, basically, right? Back down. This has nothing to do with you guys. And he's firm with them, and he says, this is the work by the hand of God that we're going to do, and you guys are out of it. And so that's important, and that's the end of chapter 2, and that's a good place to stop for today. And I think, again, we have a study group that we're using this material for, and that's why I kind of went through these verses. I'm going to drop it on YouTube. If there's any interest in it, then we can expand the study to include, we can include YouTube. I think we're going to do a couple live sessions at some point. I got to go and edit out that phone call out of the audio and the video, but I'm going to do that, and I'm going to drop it on YouTube, and we'll just see if there's any interest. We'll continue to put them on YouTube. If there's not, then we'll just keep it in the closed group. Either way, to whoever watches it, thanks. I hope it was a blessing. Hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you again. Thank you very much. God bless you.